Hi, I'm Kit, and this is Wordwise. I'm a professional fiction writer, editor, and teacher, and I'm starting this channel in order to help writers and aspiring writers refine their craft and think critically about what they read. This video begins my deep dive into the literary canon of Chad Daybell, who's about to go on trial in Idaho for 3 terrible murders. If this video got recommended to you because you're following Chad's criminal exploits, then you may not be aware that he is also the author of over a dozen truly dreadful novels. If this video got recommended to you because you're an aspiring author looking for writing advice, then you may not know that a prominent Mormon doomsday author is about to stand trial. Either way, I hope you'll stick around. Before we begin talking about Chad's first book, I want to make a few clarifications about what I do and don't intend to do with this series. First of all, I don't intend to make light of what happened to Charles Vallow, Tammy Douglas Daybell, J.J. Vallow, or Tylee Ryan. What happened to them isn't funny, their loved ones' suffering isn't entertainment, and I hope that everyone involved can find peace and healing. I'm also not here to make fun of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Everyone has their own spiritual beliefs. I have my own spiritual beliefs. And if you're looking for commentary that's critical of the LDS Church, there are plenty of channels for that. Also, Chad Daybell's beliefs are so far out there that I don't think he can be considered a Mormon at this point, so there's that. What I do intend to do is threefold. First, I want to look at Chad's psychology through the lens of his writing. What can we deduce based on how he writes and what he chooses to write? Can we see the ideas at the heart of his cult taking root in these stories? Spoiler alert, we can. Second, I have long held that there's much to be learned from reading terrible fiction. I read a lot of dollar store fiction when I was a teenager, literal bottom barrel garbage, like they had it in a barrel. And I think we can grow tremendously as writers through that process. Learning to identify where others have tripped up helps us to learn to identify where we're tripping up. People sometimes don't believe me when I say this, but you really can learn so much from reading bad fiction. Third, I want to have a little fun. It's hard not to laugh at bad writing, and while I would never publicly mock writers who are giving it their best and honing their craft, this one turned out to be a serial killer. Allegedly. I feel a little less like I have to be considerate of his feelings given what he's done. Allegedly. So that's the plan. A little true crime, a little fiction workshop, hopefully a few chuckles along the way. I'll also be making videos on more traditional writing topics like plotting, adverb use, opening hooks, but for this series, I want to focus on Chad's writing. Here's some relevant background information on Chad Daybell. He was born in an LDS family in Springville, Utah, where he grew up. He served a Mormon mission for 2 years in Newark, New Jersey, which he likens to the 10th Circle of Hell, and then he attended Brigham Young University, where he earned a degree in journalism. He married a woman named Tammy Douglas, and together they had 5 children. Chad worked a number of jobs over the years, ranging from newspaper editor to computer salesman. But most interestingly, he worked at least 2 separate stints as cemetery sexton. A cemetery sexton tends to the grounds of a cemetery and digs graves. So in 1999, he published his first novel, and then later he opened his own publishing house and published books that both he wrote and some other people wrote, notably Julie Rowe. If you've dug into the subgenre of Mormon near-death experience memoirs, you'll know who Julie Rowe is. His books were quite successful in the LDS community. He became a popular speaker at Doomsday Prepper conferences, and it was at one of these conferences that he met a woman named Lori Vallow, who was a big fan of his novels. Lori was married to her 4th husband at the time, and she and Chad immediately became obsessed with each other and with Chad's increasingly bizarre religious beliefs, which involved zombies, portals, and psychic powers. They formed a small cult of like-minded individuals with Chad as the leader, and then Chad and Lori embarked on a crime spree to eliminate anyone who stood in the way of their relationship. Allegedly. At the time of this recording, Lori has been convicted in the deaths of Chad's wife, Tammy Douglas Daybell, Lori's daughter, Tylee Ryan, who was 16, and Lori's son, J.J. Vallow, who was only 7. Chad's trial in those deaths is set to start in a couple of months, and Lori has been extradited to Arizona to stand trial in the death of her 4th husband, Charles Vallow, who was JJ's father. We'll begin with Chad's first novel, An Errand for Emma, which was published in 1999. At the time, Chad was happily married to Tammy. I bought this book on eBay. I believe it is a first edition. The pages started falling out as soon as I opened it. That has been a problem with every single one of Chad's books that I've purchased. I can't understand it. He has different publishers, but they all have very cheap bindings. Anyway, it has a pretty mind-blowingly bad cover, in my opinion. It's so early 2000s, though. There's just something about it. The font with the shadow and everything. Anyway, when I decided to read the sequels, I went back to eBay, and it was cheaper to get all three of them than just the second and third. So I have 2 copies. We'll read from this one, because I don't want to damage my precious first edition, which I plan to have hermetically sealed in argon gas. So, honestly, I felt a little chill when I realized Chad had dedicated this book to Tammy. To Tammy, my wife and best friend. Her inspired ideas and suggestions made this book possible. Things were better between them, I think, earlier in their relationship. It seems like Tammy was a really lovely person. She worked in an elementary school library, and her siblings have started a literacy foundation that I'll link below in case you'd like to keep Tammy's memory alive and help kids learn to read. All right, on to An Errand for Emma. I tumbled down the Wilkinson Center stairs, bounced off a wall, and rolled to a stop. I rubbed my bruised knees as one of my Brigham Young University classmates rushed to my side. "Emma, that looked terrible," he said. "Are you all right?" "I think so. My knees took the worst of it." I gathered up my scattered textbooks, and he helped me to my feet. "Wow, I was sure you'd crack your head open." "I'm afraid this happens all too often," I said. "I've had worse falls. My feet just do what they want sometimes." This is our introduction to Emma, the protagonist of An Errand for Emma. Originally, by the way, this book was supposed to be titled Tripping Through Time, which, although it's really corny, I think is a better title. An Errand for Emma makes it sound like she's going to the store for milk. Emma was named after one of Chad's daughters. All of his characters are named after real people. Now, in an almost exclusively technical sense, Chad has accomplished something that I actively encourage writers to do. He's told his readers the 2 most important things to know about Emma right at the start. She's Mormon, and she's clumsy. That's really important. Chad is obsessed with her clumsiness. Now, because first pages, first chapters, openings are so important to getting your writers hooked into your reading, I'm going to break down this section in depth a little. First of all, I think this is a strange way to open a novel. The first time I read it, I thought he was attempting like a meet cute between Emma and this random classmate, but he never appears again. He never gets named, and I don't know who he is. The fall ends up having no bearing on the story, except to demonstrate that Emma's really clumsy. I think Chad just thought that a fall down the stairs would be an exciting event that would draw in readers, you know? Like how action movies always have something blow up 10 minutes in. But it's not really that exciting. People fall down the stairs all the time. Then there are the details of this particular fall. The word tumble generally suggests that one is upside down at some point, as does roll. The idea that she's actually bouncing off walls also says, this is a terrible fall down a flight of stairs, and yet she pops right back onto her feet. As someone who has taken many falls, and is kind of famous for it, I can say with complete confidence that if you actually roll down a flight of stairs, you aren't going to bounce back up, and you don't think you're okay. There's also an issue with the dialogue here that I think is worth pointing out, but I'm going to preface it by saying that there's value both in subverting and conforming to expectations. So as a writer, you can reinforce a character trait by having a character act in exactly the way we expect them to. Or you can add depth and complexity by having them do something unexpected. So let's look at this bit of dialogue with one word removed, right? "Are you all right?" "I think so. My blank took the worst of it." We expect people to say something that will reassure the listener that they're all right when they say, "my blank took the worst of it." it's sort of a dismissive expression. So my butt took the worst of it, or even my backpack took the worst of it. Those statements kind of conform to our expectations. Or we could have the character subvert expectations. For example, my partner fell on the stairs last week, and when I asked if he was all right, he said, my pride took the worst of it. I thought it was kind of funny since I had just written this section on how I wanted to talk about this. So this isn't something most writers probably think about consciously, and we don't need to, because most of us intuit these expectations. But what Chad does here is prove to us that he hasn't intuited these expectations. He doesn't know that we're expecting a confirmation or a subversion, because what he writes is, my knees took the worst of it. Our knees are poorly padded. If your knees took the worst of a fall down a flight of stairs, a fall that involved you turning upside down, you are not popping back up. And what most perplexes me about this opening and the fall is it has nothing to do with the rest of the story. Immediately afterward, Chad goes into a flashback, and technically, it lasts the entire rest of the novel. I'm not sure why he didn't just begin a bit earlier with the events of the flashback and skip this like partial scene here. So in the flashback, Emma talks about the difficult last year of high school she had. She mentions her visiting teacher, Leah. If I understand correctly, Latter-day Saints usually receive a monthly visit from another member of the congregation. This person used to be called a visiting teacher. I think they've changed the terminology now, but I don't know what the correct new phrase is. I'm just going to say visiting teacher since that's what's in the book. Emma is very close to her visiting teacher, Leah, who is also named after one of Chad's children, his other daughter. He has two daughters, Emma and Leah. We hear a bit about Emma's friendship with Leah, and then we get our first insight into who Chad is. This is the point at which he leaks, as I put it. And all writers leak. I leak. There is an extent to which a writer cannot escape their own perspective, and so it kind of trickles into our writing without us even realizing it. It's all the unconscious stuff that we end up putting in. But most of us manage to disguise our perspective a little better than Chad does. Leah, I've seen your family pictures on your wall. You were an attractive young woman. Didn't you ever have an opportunity to get married? She laughed and said, I've only saved my most flattering pictures. I've suffered through plenty of bad hair days. Chad is very superficial when it comes to women. He's superficial about everyone, but especially about women. He's very concerned with what women look like. I don't remember who he said this to. It might have been his sister-in-law, Heather Daybell. But there was someone who asked him what Lori Vallow was like, and his response was, she's hot and loaded. That pretty much tells you where his values lie, although he'll try to deny that he cares about money. He does, but he'll try to deny it because he hasn't ever had any. Anyway, Leah assures Emma that despite her bad hair days, she was once engaged to a young man who was killed in World War II before they could get married. And then Leah has a heart attack and dies. It's page 4, and Leah is already dead. Thus ends chapter 1. Chapter 2 begins with Leah's funeral, but almost immediately goes into another flashback to give us some background information on Emma's family. I don't hate this in theory. I have a very fraught relationship with the advice, show, don't tell, because it's led to a lot of writers trying to avoid just giving their readers information directly. Instead, they info dump in dialogue in a way that is unnatural and ineffective, even when it would make more sense to just tell the reader what's going on. I think the real trick is to balance showing and telling. Know when to do one and when to do the other. So I don't hate that Chad just tells us about Emma's family. What I do hate, though, is what Chad tells us about Chad here. And if you think I'm ragging on Chad by accusing him of channeling his own feelings into this character, don't worry, I have plenty of proof. I've read Chad's autobiography, Living on the Edge of Heaven, in which he admits he has no creativity. And because of that, he can really only write characters based on himself. Every single character he's ever written is a Mary Sue. Keep that in mind. Here's how he describes Emma's family. Dad is a well-respected electrician, and Mom is a full-time homemaker. They are nice, friendly people, but certainly not famous. As the oldest child, I felt sure I'd be the one to bring glory to my family. Doug was merely my messy younger brother who spent all his times playing sports and wouldn't amount to much. Now, I don't think of myself as someone who lacks ambition, but I personally have never expected to bring glory to my family. Nor have I ever thought that my younger sister wouldn't amount to much. But you know who's felt that way? Chad. And I think this line here, they are nice, friendly people, but certainly not famous. Why would they be famous? Like, why is that a measuring stick you're even holding up against them? It's just his assumption that you'd want your family to be famous, right? You want to bring glory to your family, apparently. And Chad himself is the youngest of 5. Here is a line from his autobiography. This is a scene where he had decided to apply for a master's program. And then as he was writing the application, God told him to stop because he wasn't meant to get a master's degree. The interesting thing is that although I was the most studious of my brothers, they all now have advanced degrees and I don't. According to Heather Daybell, who's married to Chad's brother Matt, Chad was always jealous of his brothers, and she felt like that scene in the book was directly intended as a slight against Matt. By the way, if you want to see an interview with a woman who genuinely seems like a wonderful person and has fascinating insights on Chad, go to Hidden True Crime on YouTube and check out Lauren and Dr. John's interviews with Heather Daybell. In fact, just watch everything Hidden True Crime has done. They're amazing. And Heather is a fascinating person. I loved her interview. I watched it twice and it's 5 hours long. Anyway, this certainly seems to be a moment when Chad has grafted his experience with his own brothers onto Emma's relationship with her brother. Emma is basically upset because her brother has become locally famous as an athlete known as Doug Double D Dalton. Don't get me started on that nickname. Chad implies that it's based on Doug's initials, but I don't believe him. I think he's just immature and amused by the references to a certain undergarment. Emma relates all of Doug's athletic success and then says, I struggled a bit at becoming Double D's big sister. His success wouldn't have bothered me so much, except that it never went to his head. If he'd been cocky, I still could have felt superior. Why do you need to feel superior to your brother, Emma? By which I mean Chad. Can't you just be happy for him and develop your own interests? Apparently not. So now we know that Emma is Mormon, she's clumsy, and she has an inferiority complex. As does Chad. Although, maybe not the clumsy part. I have no info on that. We get another flash of outright sexism here. I still hoped great things awaited me, yet I had no idea what these things could be compared to Doug's success. But when I was at my lowest, Leah was at her best. You seem a little down, dear, Leah would say. Too many boys to choose from. Because the only thing that could ever bother a teenage girl is boys, right? But then we go right back to Emma's inferiority complex. No, I just feel invisible at school and at home. It's always Doug this and Doug that. I'm sick of it. There's more to life than Doug. You said it, she replied curtly. I stared at her, glad she agreed. Sports and popularity may seem important, but they don't mean much in the long run, she said. Emma, you've got a mission to perform that will someday mean more than all of Doug's hits, touchdowns, and baskets combined. What blows me away about this interaction is that Leah can't comfort Emma without diminishing Doug. Instead of saying, you don't need to compare yourself to him, you're both special and talented in different ways, she says, the things Doug is good at are meaningless. And this is described as Leah at her best. Chad's writing consistently demonstrates that he has no sense of what people are like. He struggles to describe them in a logical way, and I think that's because he fundamentally doesn't understand people. There was that mission talk again. Despite my own doubts about that mission, her assurances helped me keep my head up, even when the rest of the world thought I was just an airhead. My light brown hair, blue eyes, and gangly frame did fit the mold, especially when combined with my clumsiness, but it just wasn't true. I did well in school and seminary, and I knew that somewhere there was a wonderful prince waiting for me who would understand his sometimes spacey princess. She's an airhead who's also really good in school? I'm not sure Chad knows what an airhead is. I even thought that maybe this physical description related to a stereotype I wasn't familiar with, so I did an image search for airhead and then airhead woman. I even went to Getty Images to look it up. All I could find was that this is a popular nickname for female pilots and WPGA players, which makes sense but isn't relevant to this story. I think Chad just doesn't know what an airhead is. So we see a bit of Leah's funeral. Emma steals a rose from a floral arrangement someone else has brought and throws it in the casket because she's classy like that. And then she wanders around the cemetery by herself to look at the graves of her dead ancestors. Specifically, her great-grandfather Keith and her 5 times great-grandfather Finity. I was not able to find any information on the name Finity. It might be unique. I do have a photo of him because he's Chad's real ancestor, and Chad included his photo in his autobiography. I also found this photo of Finity online and a picture of Finity's grave. Not only did Chad name all of his characters after people he actually knows, he used his family as the model for the Daltons. Only model isn't a strong enough word in my opinion. He literally just changed their last name from Daybell to Dalton. That's it. Every story that he tells in here about them actually happened. Their birth dates, death dates, where the whole thing. It's all just them. And I shouldn't even say that's my opinion either, because Chad literally wrote about it on his website, which is still up, and you can go check it out if you're interested. As I said before, Chad has no creativity. And here I'll quote from his autobiography. I don't fictionalize any of the events portrayed. I'm really not that creative. Let me describe how my writing process occurs. My torn veil allows information to be downloaded into my brain from the other side. The scenes I'm shown are real events that will happen, but it's my job to fit them into the lives of the fictional families in my novels. Here he's referring specifically to a later series he wrote that deals with the second coming of Jesus and the end of the world. The torn veil is, there's supposed to be a veil that prevents us from remembering our lives in heaven before we were born, because Mormons believe in a previous life in heaven. He says that he had near-death experiences that ripped his veil, and so he's able to access information from heaven and the spirit world, and he uses that information to write his books. Okay. So Emma leaps from thinking about her ancestors to another flashback about how, after graduating from high school the spring before, she and her friends started going dancing at clubs. I mention this part only because in the 3rd book of this series, one of the friends, Angie, will reappear. But basically, Emma went clubbing with Angie a few times before realizing she had strayed from the Lord's path and deciding to spend her time reading the Book of Mormon instead. Chad has a conflicted relationship with dancing. It's fascinating. He mentions dancing over and over. It has an outsized presence in his mind, and sometimes he finds it acceptable. Square dancing seems to be okay. But often it's depicted as dangerously erotic and indicative of a sinful heart. If I were to indulge in pure speculation, I would say that Chad had some seminal experience involving dancing. I've never heard it mentioned in any of his interviews, except there is that video of him and Lori dancing on the beach in Hawaii right after they got married. So I guess he was right. Dancing does mean you have a sinful heart. But I want to point one other thing out from this section. I love to dance, partly because it is the only time I'm sure-footed. No. Just no. You cannot have a character whose defining characteristic is clumsiness suddenly become sure-footed when she dances. That makes no sense. It's completely unacceptable. Anyway, I think what happened was that Chad wanted to put Emma in a situation, namely in a nightclub, and then realized that a character who's excessively clumsy probably wouldn't go to a nightclub, so he came up with this excuse to try to explain the contradiction. But to that, I just say, do better. Like, this is a cop-out. What he should have done was pick a different activity for Emma and Angie to participate in. It might have required a few minutes of thought, but that's the work you have to do when you're a writer. But Chad has no creativity, so he probably couldn't come up with anything. Emma and her brother Doug read the Book of Mormon. We read the last 2 chapters as a family, and I could feel the spirit strongly. As I mentioned before, I'm not LDS. I realize these books were intended for an LDS audience, but even so, I think this point stands. I, as a reader, need a more detailed description of what feeling the spirit feels like, because I assume there's natural variation in how each person experiences that connection. Feeling close to God is also really, really important in spiritual fiction, especially books like this that are intended to strengthen the reader's testimony. And the success of this type of story depends on readers being able to feel that wonder and closeness and joy in their relationship with God. A single adverb isn't enough. Unfortunately, Chad uses this line repeatedly, and not just in this book. He needs to work on fleshing out his descriptions. Assuming he's still writing, which I guess that depends on whether or not he's allowed to have a pencil in jail. Anyway, this is a general rule for writing. If something in your story is important, let your readers know that by providing a description of sufficient color and complexity. Make it evocative and memorable. It's also in this chapter that we get the first taste of Chad's fat phobia, because, like most shallow people, he's fat phobic. We've searched through many English records, but in 19th century England, the name Thomas Cooper was as common as Bill Smith is today. So finding the right Thomas Cooper has been like trying to find a slightly overweight friend wearing a hat and sunglasses at a BYU football game. It's kind of an odd dig at his alma mater. What Emma's father is referencing here is his family's attempt to trace his ancestors. This requires a little explanation, and I apologize to any Mormons who are listening if I don't get this quite right. In the LDS faith, in order to get into heaven, you have to have undergone certain temple ordinances, which are like ceremonies, or if you're Catholic or Episcopalian, they're like sacraments. Baptism, marriage, that kind of thing. If you die and you haven't undergone these rites, then you don't get to go to paradise, even if you were a good person. You get sent someplace called spirit prison until the resurrection. While you're in spirit prison, the souls in paradise can teach you about Jesus. But the key seems to be that someone in the living world has to perform these ordinances on your behalf. So living Latter-day Saints will go to the temple and get baptized on behalf of dead people. It's actually more complicated than that, but I'll leave further description until we talk about Chad's 4th book. Honestly, I have a bit of a hard time with the idea of proxy baptism, and there's been a lot of controversy around it. I'm not sure how baptizing the dead is different from baptizing people against their will. And I can say with certainty that if I joined the LDS Church and got baptized on behalf of my grandparents, all 4 of them would be furious. That said, it's clear that this is very important to faithful Mormons, and it forms the motivation for the plot of this story. In order to be with your family in heaven, you need to be sealed to them, which is one of the ordinances that gets performed in the temple. And so having family members who haven't been sealed to you or haven't had their temple work done, as it's called, means that you could end up in paradise and they could end up in spirit prison and you wouldn't be together. So that's kind of the motivation of this story, is they're trying to get information about Emma's mother's family. They haven't been able to track down her mother's great-great-great-grandparents, and without their names, they can't receive the proper temple ordinances, and they might not get to spend eternity with the rest of the family. So while Emma's in the cemetery, when she ought to be thinking about her dear friend she just buried, she's instead praying to find her ancestors' genealogical records. She pauses to inspect a headstone with a lamb carved into the top, and I'll give credit where credit is due. I like this symbolism. this subtle reference to Jesus as the Lamb of God. Emma prays, and immediately Jesus answers by causing her to trip and slam her head on the lamb headstone, sending her 130 years into the past. And thus ends chapter 2. You weren't expecting this to be a time travel story, were you? Neither was I. I didn't even read the back before I started, but I was excited at first when I realized what had happened. I have an MFA in writing, and for my master's thesis, which is just a big research paper, I studied time travel devices in young adult literature. I analyzed how authors take an inherently improbable idea and make it more plausible by developing rules for how time travel works and inventing pseudoscientific time travel devices. For example, one book I wrote about was the third Harry Potter book, where Hermione has the time turner that she uses to attend 18 classes at once. I didn't know that An Errand for Emma was a time travel book when I started reading it, because I didn't read the back cover because I like to go in fresh. But I can say, as a bit of an expert in the time travel fiction field, that having head trauma as your time travel device is the second laziest time travel concept I've ever read. It's absolute garbage. The only one I've read that was worse was in this painfully bad young adult novel, where anyone who was exactly 5 feet tall could walk through a height chart into the future. Made no sense. And at least Chad's book sort of understands that God is just using traumatic brain injuries to accomplish his will. But it's still a wretchedly lazy, random concept, especially when you know where he got it. Because, of course, he didn't even manage to make this up. A few months later, little 1-year-old Emma was playing in our backyard. I told her to come inside so she wouldn't get hurt, but as I turned my back on her for a brief second, she fell and hit her forehead on our back step. This incident was also the basis of what later became a key scene in my first novel, An Errand for Emma, where Emma hits her head on a tombstone and goes back in time. Chapter 3 opens with yet another strange image. Gritty sand pressed into my cheek as I lay motionless on the ground. I felt movement near my head, and I opened my eyes to find myself staring into the face of a mouse that was pawing gently at my hair. Because wild mice love people and will approach in order to grope them. Emma scares the mouse off. She looks around at the grasslands and nearby lake and has a realization. Could I possibly have knocked myself into a previous time? From the looks of things, maybe the Mormon pioneers hadn't even arrived in Utah Valley yet. This is the third paragraph of this chapter. She's been in the past for less than a page. She hasn't seen anyone but a bold and possibly lecherous mouse, and she's already figured out she's gone back in time. By the end of the paragraph, she's come to terms with this astonishing turn of events. Now, personally, I'm a writer who sometimes errs in the opposite direction. I will spend too long developing my characters' feelings and leading them to realizations, because I feel like it's more realistic. So my stories can move too slowly, and that's the kind of thing I have to keep an eye on, especially in editing. If you do the same thing with your writing, I suggest reading everything aloud. I mean, I suggest that no matter what kind of writer you are, but especially if you tend to write things that are a little too slow. You will hear when a scene starts dragging, and then you can tighten it up. I'm not really sure what the cure is for blitzing through momentous events like Chad does, other than to just slow down. But this certainly won't be the last time he does it. It's kind of like he just wants to get the realization that she's traveled through time out of the way and on with the story or something. She sees 2 covered wagons in the distance, so she goes running toward them, hollering, "Come on, legs, you can do it!" Apparently at her own legs. They needed encouragement. As the last wagon approached, I made one final leap, soaring through the tall weeds and sprawling across the dirt into the wagon's path. Quick public service announcement. Don't hurl yourself in front of horses. Don't do it in the past. Don't do it in the present. It's a terrible idea. Horses can't see in front of themselves. It turns out that the man driving the wagon that nearly ran her over is none other than Brigham Young himself. If you don't know, Brigham Young was the second president of the LDS Church. He had more than 50 wives, he founded 2 universities, and he described slavery as a divine institution. Although he waffled on that somewhat later, it seems like he just told whoever he was talking to what they wanted to hear when it came to slavery. I can't really blame Chad for bringing Brigham Young in. I can see where, if you're an LDS reader, you might get excited by reading a book where famous Mormons make cameos. But I do take issue with how Chad uses Brigham Young, which we'll get to soon. Anyway, his appearance marks the end of chapter 3. Emma bums a ride into town with Brigham Young and his companions. All the townspeople stream outside to throw a parade, which I guess they do every time Brigham comes through town. And we get to this. I couldn't help but notice the residents' clothes. Despite the hot day, the men all wore plain wool pants, long-sleeve shirts, and sturdy boots. Hats and suspenders were common, as were mustaches and beards. The women all wore long dresses, some more fancy than others, but none more fancy than the plainest dress in a modern closet. Sturdy boots or sandals were the ladies' favorite footwear. Most of the older women wore white bonnets, while most of the girls my age and younger wore their hair in braids. If you're going to write historical fiction, do your research. I realize it's not the most exciting part of the writing process, but it's essential. I mean, sandals? Did Chad do any research on this issue? The only people who wore wool pants in late summer in Utah were people who only owned one pair of pants. And I don't know how dresses could be less fancy than like a modern sheath dress. I don't even think he went and watched Little House on the Prairie or anything. I actually figured out where he got these ideas, but I don't think they're well described, and definitely he came up with the sandals thing. That just makes no sense. No one was wearing sandals. It's also ridiculous to me that no one seems to find it strange that Emma's wearing a denim jumper and a t-shirt. They even put it on the cover model. Not only would the cut of this jumper have been very unusual in the 1860s, when they did not have spaghetti straps, but denim didn't become popular as a clothing fabric until a decade after this, and then it was only as men's work pants. So the people in this town would have been asking themselves, why is that woman wearing Greek sandals and a dress made from a tent? And yet no one comments on it. And what kind of outfit is this for a funeral? Sorry, that's the end of my rant. I've spent 15 years working on a historical novel. I have done painful amounts of research. I don't think that Chad understands that people who read historical fiction are usually people who relish historical details. That's why we read historical fiction. We get excited about knowing exactly what kind of footwear people have on. So after they have the parade, Emma's forced to use an outhouse for the first time, and then Brigham Young hands her off to a woman named Rachel who lets Emma take a nap in her bed. Because she's just nice like that. Emma has a dream in which she sees the words Denver and Cooper, the name of her mother's ancestors, illuminated, and then the words turn into fan blades. I ducked twice to avoid getting hit, but then the words' rotations coincided, and I knew I was going to get sliced in half. As the words swung toward me again, I let out a scream of terror. I guess Chad thought that a nightmare would make an exciting end to chapter 4. That evening, Emma meets with her hosts and Brigham Young. Brigham nodded. I have prayed concerning your peculiar arrival among us, and the Lord has confirmed that you have come to us from a future time. Is that true? I let out a sigh of relief, glad that someone finally seemed to understand my plight. I nodded and said, yes, that's right. Rachel gasped. Now, before I get to why I hate this, let me just point out how hilarious it is that Rachel gasps in the wrong place in this text. Obviously, her expression of shock should come when she first hears Brigham Young say, you're from the future, not when she hears Emma say, yep. But that's just amusing. Unfortunately, this scene marks the first really prominent instance of what will become a more and more overused plot crutch until it just kind of takes over Chad's writing entirely. And that is, God fixes it. I'm not saying that God can't occasionally fix things or that there's no place for miracles in fiction or in life. What I'm saying is, Chad relies way too heavily on this. Our character has a dilemma. Based on her nightmare, she believes she needs to go find her mother's ancestors, the Coopers, in 1860s Denver. How is she going to get there? She has no money, no transportation. She doesn't even have a map, right? She just has an ugly denim jumper and a pair of what I like to imagine are jelly sandals. But instead of letting Emma be clever or smart or even just determined, Chad just has God fix it. She doesn't have to explain that she's from the future and convince Brigham Young. God just tells him. And then God tells him that he has to do whatever he can to help Emma with her mission. So he asks her hosts if they could take her to the home of her ancestor Finity Dalton a couple of towns over. The solution doesn't even originate with Emma. She has no ownership whatsoever. Character agency is really important in fiction. We want to see protagonists making decisions and taking action. And instead, Emma is just like a child who lets the adults do all the work. The next morning, she sets out with Brigham Young and Rachel's sons. They ride cover wagons to Provo, where there's another parade. And I only mention this because there's a passage here that I think is interesting psychologically. I joined the crowd watching the brass band play. A few fiddle players and a washboard player had joined them, along with an older white-haired man holding a glass jug. The band launched into an extremely upbeat version of The Spirit of God, and I clapped along, chuckling at the man playing the jug. He puffed with all his might, trying to keep up with the band's tempo. The jug's low hoot, hoot, hoot added a nice bass sound for a few minutes, until the old man comically fell to the ground, visibly worn out. The crowd laughed and cheered, and he stood and bowed solemnly before grabbing his jug and rejoining the band. Did this old man hyperventilate and faint? And did everyone laugh at him? Chad seems to have included this for amusement, but it's incredibly antisocial. If I see an old guy pass out, I'm going to run over and check on him, not laugh. There's been a lot of debate over whether or not Chad is a psychopath. I'm not qualified to even guess. But I can say with confidence that there is a striking lack of compassion here. Thus ends Chapter 5. Chapter 6 introduces the Johnson boys, Will and Moses. I'd been surprised to learn Moses was only 8 because he handled himself like a small adult. But as sons of Bishop Johnson, they were accustomed to being asked to fulfill heavy tasks with little notice. This is strange, and it's the first incident of a chilling trend in Chad's writing. He writes children exactly the way he writes adults. When I say he doesn't understand how people work, that includes not understanding the difference between children and adults. At the time he wrote this, he had 4, if not 5, children of his own, so it's not like he had no experience around kids, but it's an issue that will come up over and over. I'm also pretty skeptical that these parents would send an 18-year-old, a 19-year-old, and an 8-year-old alone on an overnight trip. Even if they were confident in the teenager's ability to survive, there's a lot of mischief they could get into, which I guess was also on Chad's mind. Is Will always this serious? I asked. Don't you know why Will is guiding us rather than one of my other brothers? No, I hadn't even thought about it. It's because he's already asked for someone's hand in marriage. Papa knew he wouldn't try courting you. Yeah, I'm sure courting is what he was concerned about. This is kind of ironic, coming from a man who definitely committed adultery. Then there's a passage where Moses explains that all the boys in town wanted to meet Emma the night before because she's so pretty. All my brothers and their friends saw you riding with the prophet as you came into town, and they all said you were pretty. They wanted to meet you at last night's meeting, but you never showed up. He laughed and slapped his thigh. Those were some disappointed boys. When Papa overheard them talking about you, he knew Will and I were the only ones he could trust not to bother you. Will's girlfriend wasn't happy, but that's life. This implies that Will is under some obligation to be rude to Emma to make it clear that he doesn't find her attractive, which is stupid and immature and a pox on Will's girlfriend if she's so insecure that she put him up to that. I think it tells us something about Chad, but I also think that his need to make Emma pretty stems from his own insecurities and narcissism. If a character is a stand-in for the author, and that author is insecure about their looks, they're going to make the character super attractive. And he takes every opportunity to mention this about her. And while I am not a stickler for period authentic speech, girlfriend and that's life are both anachronisms. I don't like period speech that sounds awkward and formal. I think it can really distance readers from characters. But I also think that writers of historical fiction need to be careful not to use words or terms that are obviously wrong for the time, like girlfriend, which didn't start to be associated with a female romantic interest until after the turn of the century. And that took like a minute and a half to Google. This chapter is actually rife with historical errors. Emma, Will, and Moses camp for the night. We heated up the rest of the stew Rachel had made the night before, and it still tasted great. And 2 days later, they were all dead of botulism because this stew has been off the stove and unrefrigerated for more than 24 hours. Maybe Rachel could have stored it, overnight in a cool cellar, but there's no way they could have kept it chilled while riding all day. Chad didn't really take any time to think about what makes sense in these circumstances. Here's another example regarding their breakfast the next morning. I sat on a log next to Will, and he handed me a plate holding 2 fish. Just tear pieces off with your fingers, he said. So Will packed plates, bowls, spoons, a jug of rotting stew, and a cooking pot. But no forks or knives? Like, why didn't he just leave all that at home and bring a sack of hardtack instead? As I mentioned before, Chad is fat-phobic. It only comes up a couple times in this book, but it's basically its own subplot in Escape to Zion. I quickly finished off the 2 fish and then another. Hey, leave some for us, Will said teasingly. Do I have to go catch some more? I could have eaten another one, I said, but I'm ready to get back on the trail. Will reached into his pack, then tossed me a sack filled with deer jerky. I brought this along for you, he said. I heard that despite your small frame, you have quite an appetite. Oink, oink, Moses said. Is that why you were covered with mud? Are you calling me a pig? I playfully shoved him off the rock he was sitting on. Will stepped between us. That's enough. It's time to get going. Then he gave us a sly smile. Besides, you both eat like pigs. There's a part right after Emma finds herself in the past when she falls into a mud pit, and I could never figure out why Chad included it until I started thinking about this interaction. And I really think he literally put it in there so that he could have mature as an adult Moses call her a pig. I really think he thought it was hilarious, and that's why he put it in there. Also, just in a practical sense, who would have told Will that Emma had quite an appetite? It's not the kind of thing people generally tell each other. Yeah, that's my friend Sharon. She has quite an appetite. So they travel all day and finally arrive at a farm where they stop to ask for directions. And lo and behold, the first farm they stop at is the one they're looking for. Finity answers the door. I did a little research on Finity and the part of England he immigrated from, and I'm going to attempt to read his dialogue in a Lancashire dialect. We'll see how that goes. Hello, we're looking for the Dalton farm, I said. This must be it. It sure is, the man said with a British accent. May I help you? I grabbed his hand, barely holding back tears. I am Emma Dalton, and I've traveled a very long way to find you. You're a relative, then, the man said. Come right in and make yourselves comfortable. Infinity Dalton. Well, that was pretty terrible. They all eat dinner together. Will and Moses take off. Thus ends chapter 6. After dinner, Emma, Finity, and his wife Mary chat. Finity asks all sorts of questions that a normal person would have asked before dinner, like, how are we related? Emma produces a letter from Brigham Young. This is part of the letter. I feel impressed that you or another family member must help Emma reach Denver, find the information she needs, and then return again. I realize that it is nearly harvest time and every able hand is needed. But Emma's mission is of much greater importance than that of wheat and corn. What this sentence means is that wheat and corn have a mission, but that mission is less important than Emma's mission, which I don't think is what Chad meant to write, and his editor didn't pick up on it. Frankly, the more I ponder this book, the less I understand why God sent her back to this time. Like, couldn't he have just sent her back after the harvest? Pioneers routinely starve to death. Or why not just send her to England? Can God not move her, like, through time and from one place to another? Actually, God never does move her from one place to another, so maybe that's a time travel rule in Chad's universe, that you can only go to the exact same place. Even though, because the Earth is moving and rotating, you would end up somewhere entirely different if you didn't change places. But anyway, that doesn't matter. That's getting more technical than I think is probably fair. But I do wonder why God sent her back now and here. This is as nitpicky as can be also, but there's a sentence here that really sticks in my craw. The room was silent as he concluded the letter. The room couldn't have been silent as Finity concluded reading the letter because he was making noise by reading aloud. It sounds like a ridiculous thing to complain about, but I learned from Strunk and White the importance of clarity and precision when it comes to the order of events. I won't belabor the point, though. So Mary and Finity discuss how to get Emma to Denver while avoiding starvation. They decide to send their 16-year-old son, George, with her, even though 3 of their 5 sons have died, and Mary sounds very nervous about risking the other 2. Also, Mary and Finity really get the short end of the stick throughout this story. Now they have to provision Emma and George for a trip that's going to take 2 months. They have to hire someone to do George's work during the harvest. And chapter 8 starts with Emma borrowing 2 dresses, 2 sets of undies, and a pair of shoes from Mary. Spoiler alert, they aren't getting any of that stuff back. Thus ends chapter 7. Finity and Mary also hire a 19-year-old named David to go with George and Emma, but their 12-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, warns her that David is disgusting. Elizabeth is a problematic character from start to finish. The Daltons' only daughter still at home, 12-year-old Elizabeth, had helped me pack my belongings, and we became friends. She was a bright, pretty girl, but she was also a tease, so I never knew when to take her seriously. An 18-year-old can't be friends with a 12-year-old. Actually, Emma's 19, so a 19-year-old can't be friends with a 12-year-old. You don't need to know when to take her seriously because the answer is never, because you aren't friends. She is a child. But Emma never treats her like a child. And I want to point out that this is the second child character Chad's included in this book that he either describes as an adult or attributes adult behavior to. Like, whatever is wrong with Chad, and I won't speculate, he doesn't seem to understand that there are fundamental differences between children and adults. And I can't help but wonder if that contributed to the crimes against children that he eventually participated in. Allegedly. It's very disturbing to think about when you consider that he told his cult followers that Tylee and JJ were badly behaved because they were possessed by evil spirits. There's no evidence they were actually badly behaved, by the way. I think Tylee saw through Chad's BS and wasn't afraid to call him out, and JJ was just a hyper 7-year-old. But if you expect children to act like adults, you open the door to misinterpreting their behavior. And if you happen to be a cult leader, that can lead to some very dark and tragic outcomes. I mean, describing Elizabeth as a tease is inappropriate. A tease isn't someone who teases people. And it seems like Chad deliberately misdefines this word here in order to imply something about Elizabeth that he doesn't want to say outright. Something that one simply shouldn't even think is true of a 12-year-old. In the next scene, we meet the odious David North. I turned around and gazed up into the most gorgeous blue eyes I'd ever seen. I also noticed the tan, clean-shaven face, sandy brown hair, and strong shoulders that surrounded those eyes. Emma is instantly smitten, but I personally think Elizabeth was right about David, because the only person I've ever heard of who had shoulders surrounding their eyes was the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Then Emma finds out that Elizabeth told David that Emma was also ugly, and confronts her. "But why did you tell him I was ugly?" She squirmed a little. "I just wanted to make sure he's going on this trip for the right reasons, and not because he knows there's a pretty girl going along with him. He passed the test." What is this, like, Bachelor of Oregon Trail? The right reasons? This is so manipulative and suspicious. It really gives me the ick, especially when we find out that Elizabeth did this because she's planning to marry David. Like, I can buy a 12-year-old playing a prank. I can maybe buy her having a crush on a guy 7 years older than her. But I can't buy her sabotaging the potential relationship of an adult. Like, she's 12. She just doesn't have that capacity. To back up the description of David, the Bachelor of Notre Dame, I want to mention that what he looks like is literally all we ever learn about David. Oh, and that he has a hurt hand, and that's why he isn't needed to help with the harvest. He has a hurt hand, sandy brown hair, blue eyes, and posture like this. And yet Emma can't resist him. I'd felt an immediate attraction between David and me. I felt queasy, realizing I would be spending 2 straight months with this man. How many times would I make a klutz out of myself before he lost interest in me? Has anyone actually ever dumped anyone because they were klutzy? Like, is that a thing that happens? Emma, George, and David take off. They're each riding a horse, and they have 2 pack horses. These 2 are never going to see Mary, Finity, or the farm again. Thus ends chapter 8. I find it hard to imagine what Chad was envisioning when he set about writing this section, where they're just traveling for days on end. Did he think people would find reading about other people slowly traveling exciting? It's not exciting. He describes the animals they see on the trail. We discover that Emma hasn't thought to prepare a plausible story to give George and David about where she's from, so she just gets flustered and stalked off, and David declares, "I'll never understand women." George tells a story about how funny he thought it was that one of their pigs got an arrow shot through its ear, which doesn't suggest that he or Chad are very compassionate people. They pass a lot of other Mormons along the way, and then finally they arrive at Fort Bridger. It's at this point that another psychological facet of Chad Daybell becomes apparent. He's divided the world into good people and bad people. There's no subtlety, there's no nuance, there are no shades of gray. And while this rule isn't quite as hard and fast in this book as it is in his others, by and large, the good people are all Latter-day Saints, and the bad people are just everyone else on the planet. I found 2 exceptions in this book, and one of them is a relative of Emma's, so I think Chad felt obligated to make her less awful out of like a narcissistic need to not tarnish his own image, since this woman is an actual relative of his. The other travelers at the fort, however, weren't anything like the gentle pioneers we'd seen on the trail. This was a whole different class of humanity. Near the stables, men stood around in small groups, hooting and hollering. They all had liquor on their breath and gold on their minds. This continues inside a general store. Nearly every conversation was peppered with profanity, and the main topics seemed to be gold and women. The store was an endless eruption of noise as eager prospectors shouted and bickered in their haste to get what they needed and start back to the mining fields. Despite their hurry, the men found time to smile and leer at me. George ends up punching a guy, and they have to get out of there. Once we were several miles beyond Fort Bridger, we finally relaxed a little and shared with each other the absurdities we'd seen. By the end of the day, we'd laughed so hard that our sides hurt. A lot of people have commented on Chad's terrible sense of humor, and all of his characters share it. I don't know exactly what's funny about a bunch of people trying to buy supplies so they can get back to work. By that logic, instead of comedy clubs, we should just go to Home Depot or Office Max and like point and laugh and be like, ha ha, are you going to work? I don't really get it, but Chad's characters apparently thought it was very funny that these people were trying to buy supplies for their mining operation. This trip is so boring that the characters actually spend part of it reading the Book of Mormon aloud to each other, which is weird to me mostly because I can't figure out why they'd have a copy with them. Like, Chad specifies that George and David have never read the book. Emma doesn't have anything she didn't borrow from Finity and Mary. And, like, a Book of Mormon back then would have been valuable. It's not the kind of thing you would have sent with teenagers on a trip. I don't know. It seems like a bad idea. Anyway, they read the book aloud. I read to them several of the war-oriented parts and 3 Nephite parts that Doug liked, and the men ate it up. That stuff is great, David said. After seeing some of the wild folks out here, we might end up using some of those war strategies ourselves. So I take it back. We do learn one thing about David. He loves war stories. At this point, so they've gotten to Fort Bridger. If we assume that a horse can travel 25 miles a day, which is pretty generous given the condition of these trails, right? And they've gone from Provo to Fort Bridger. Then they've traveled for approximately 16 days. But here we learn that they've traveled for 16 days without either George or David asking exactly what they're planning to do in Denver or why they're going there. It just never came up. Emma tells them that she has to find one of her mother's relatives. What makes you think they're in Denver? David asked. I had a dream that gave me direction, I said. Then President Young gave me his strong assurances. My fortitude weakened as I saw them give each other doubting looks. Are you saying we traveled 400 miles based on a dream? David asked. Then she prays and conveniently remembers that her ancestor's sister, Esther Sheridan, lived in Denver, and she realizes that God wants her to track down Esther Sheridan. So now comes another example of God just fixing things. And I have to classify this one as a completely unforced error. There's a big thunderstorm, everybody gets wet, they're riding toward a village, and suddenly a strange man in a hooded cloak appears and says, "Stay away from there, this place is full of evil men." He shows them a cave where they can spend the night, and he's already built a fire there? It's really obvious that the man is some kind of angel or holy being, and I just don't know why this scene is in here. Chad does the Deus Ex Machina thing when he doesn't know how to get his characters through a plot point. But here he seems to have added an unnecessary plot point solely for the sake of having this stranger show up and fix it. All I can figure is that he wanted to introduce this character, who unfortunately becomes a bigger and bigger figure. So he wrote this scene. It doesn't feel organic, though. It feels really random. Sort of most of Chad's plot points, though. The next day, they meet a man in a mining town that they're passing through. If you want to know whether a character in a Chad Daybell novel is evil, you can tell just by looking. If they're evil, they'll be fat and unattractive. There was a heavy-set man in a dark suit sitting on a nearby porch. He soon wandered over to us and patted one of our horses. He oozed self-importance, and I disliked him immediately. He took a long drag on his cigar, blew the smoke in our faces, then asked, "Did you just come out of that canyon?" We said yes, and he rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "You didn't see anyone up there?" he asked. "Nobody said hello or nothing?" We shook our heads, wishing he'd leave. Instead, he just chuckled, his big belly heaving up and down. "You're some lucky folks. That's Robber's Roost up there. Those guys are always looking for fresh blood. Only fools would go through that canyon in a group smaller than 20 people." My dislike for this man was growing steadily. So Emma's offended that he called her lucky? The man glanced at David's injured hand, snorted in disgust, then moved in front of George. Who would snort at an injured hand? Thus ends chapter 9. They finally reach Denver, and George and David just start going into shops and asking people if they know Esther Sheridan, while Emma drags their 5 horses along down the street. They have no luck. They go into a saloon for lunch, and they have this exchange. A rough-looking woman with horribly bright makeup and a very short skirt came to the table, carrying 3 plates filled with juicy steaks and mashed potatoes. She set them down and asked, "What'll it be? Beer, wine, or whiskey?" "We'll just have water," I said. She shrugged, then brought us 3 glasses and a pitcher of dark brown water. "Look at that stuff," I said. "Did she get that out of a puddle?" "Maybe we should have taken the beer," George said, only half jokingly. I know Mormons don't drink alcohol, but I feel like if there's a better than 50% chance you're going to end up with dysentery, God will forgive you for having the beer. Also, why are they ordering drinks after their food has arrived? I mean, maybe they did things in a different order back in the day, but I kind of doubt it. Anyway, then a stranger shows up and says he knows where they can find Esther Sheridan. I'll let you guess whether this new guy is good or evil. A short, chubby man walked up to our table. He had a greasy brown beard and a wide-brimmed hat jammed on so tightly we could barely see his eyes. He looked casually around the saloon, then put one of his grimy hands onto the table. He's obviously another angel, right? So they follow him into an unmarked warehouse. I stepped in ahead of the others, and I heard the door shut behind us. Almost instantly, I heard a sickening whack, followed by a bone-crunching crack. I turned to see both George and David slumped to the ground. A hulking man stood over them, cautiously poking at them with a thick wooden club. Now I'm going to read this bit because I want to point out a mistake I see new writers make all the time. "They won't be going anywhere, Larry," the man said. Our short, chubby friend, who I figured was Larry, looked delighted. "Good job, John. Now tie them real good." Please think about how rarely people actually use each other's names. This sounds silly and unnatural. I know Chad did it because he wanted to be able to refer to the characters more easily, but Emma could have given them nicknames or something. Also, I feel like career criminals usually know better than to use each other's names in front of people they're victimizing. The scene continues. David started to stir, and John walloped him once more in the head, knocking him out cold. Then John began wrapping a long rope around them, tying them to each other. I think what he's saying is that John tied David and George together. Why would you tie people up like that? This is starting to feel like a Three Stooges skit. Maybe it's just because there's a guy named Larry. I don't know. But it's just a strange way to tie people up. And then they tie Emma up in an even more bizarre way. I quit fighting, and he soon had me tied to the crate in a sitting position. I cannot picture this. Was she sitting on the crate with her hands tied to the handles? Or was she sitting in the crate like it was a toilet she'd fallen into? And what is preventing her from just standing up with the crate and running off? I don't know. I don't know why Chad didn't put a little more thought into how this might work. So John leaves to find Henry, who's the third person in their group, and is Esther Sheridan's husband. Apparently they heard that George and David were looking for Esther Sheridan, and they assumed it had something to do with Henry Sheridan, and they're working with Henry. So Larry then proceeds to blurt out, "I'm glad we found you before you stirred up trouble. Henry didn't intend to kill anybody, but that guy tried to steal our share of the gold from the Poudre River claim." I apologize if Poudre is not how you pronounce the name of that river. So Emma then freaks out because she's related to a murderer, even though I can't see how the fact that her great-great-great-great-aunt's husband killed someone could reflect badly on her. They aren't even blood relatives. Thus ends chapter 10. Chapter 11 opens with Emma realizing that if she doesn't get her 4 times great-grandpa George out of this situation and he dies, she will never be born. Because apparently she just figured out how time travel works. Then, John soon returned with a fairly handsome man, who had to be Henry, with brown eyes and dark hair. He didn't look as wicked as I'd expected. He's related to Emma, distantly, but by marriage, so of course he can't be ugly, and of course he can't really be a murderer. Emma tries to explain that she doesn't know anything about gold and just wants to talk to his wife about her family, but Henry doesn't believe her and makes this kind of strange remark. And what do Esther's parents have to do with this? They've been dead for years. Besides, I've caused her enough grief dragging her from Rhode Island. She doesn't need to think about her family or she might leave. This just doesn't seem like a healthy relationship. He then info dumps the whole story of how he tried to stop someone from robbing him, and the robber fell on his knife, and it was an accident, and maybe he and Emma are blood relations after all because he's even stupider than she is. Oh, and it turns out that the guy he killed was the one we met earlier, who scoffed at David's injured hand. Henry tells Larry and John to hold Emma and her friends until he can get Esther and get out of town, and then to let them go. But as soon as he leaves, Larry decides he's going to push them off a cliff instead. He leaves to get supplies, which I can only assume means he's going to find a cliff, because what other supplies do you need to shove someone off a cliff? Anyway, Emma comes up with what suffices for a plan in this story. Larry finally left, and John sat against the door and whittled on a small piece of wood with a pocket knife. It dawned on me that getting John on our side was the only way to save us. It was time to crank up a little feminine charm. Emma's version of feminine charm is small talk. It's literally small talk. Is that a horse you're carving, John? Then a couple paragraphs later, anyway, how's the life of a miner? I asked. Do you like searching for gold? This conversation is neither feminine nor charming. There's no psychological insight, there's no cleverness, there's no development of their relationship. He asks how he likes mining and he blurts out all his emotions because that's what everyone in this story does. You ask them how they are and they'll give you a rundown of the best and worst things in their lives, as if they were like your nearest bosom buddy. Emma goes straight from, do you like searching for gold, to, do you really want to see us die? No way, he said. You're a really pretty girl, and I don't believe you'd hang out with Webster. Emma then says, I've got a plan you might like, I said. I think you deserve this gold more than Larry, so if you let us escape, you can take this gold and be out of town within an hour. This is like a Kaiser Soze level plan here. John wasn't very bright, but he was smart enough to see I was right. My plan was the only way to save our lives. Plus, it would make him a very rich man. It's a deal, he said. Larry's always been cruel to me, and this should settle the score. Let's undo those ropes. I just want to point out that the time from Larry leaving to the time when John enthusiastically unties his captives covers exactly 1 page. It's not told with a whole lot of detail and layering. And this whole time, George and David have been tied up and unconscious. And this is a long time to have been unconscious. Like, these guys have serious concussions. But this is what Chad writes about that. George snapped awake, and he soon kicked himself free. We had a tough time rousing David, though. Once we got him sitting up, he was disoriented and complained of a severe headache. But it appeared his injuries weren't too severe. Like, how could he have a severe headache without severe injuries if the headache was caused by the injuries? He's been bashed in the head with a club twice. That's 1d6 plus John's strength mod, which is probably a 4, and he had advantage on the second attack because David was prone. That kid is not waking up unless someone casts Revivify. So then John gives George a gold nugget and makes a sappy speech about how he's going to give up the life of a miner and go home to his parents in Kentucky. And Emma guilt trips him into giving her the horse he was carving. Thus ends chapter 11. Emma decides that the best thing to do is rent a hotel room so the boys can sleep off their traumatic brain injuries. But I guess she didn't think to bring any of their luggage into the room or put their 5 horses in a stable, because she watches out the hotel room window as Larry steals everything. I suspect Chad didn't realize that hotels had stables where guests could keep their horses, sort of like modern parking garages. I was surprised actually that Finity and Mary even owned 5 horses, seeing as they're subsistence farmers. But now they own none. So good work, Emma. Way to pay back their generosity. George makes a full recovery from his extended period of unconsciousness, and he decides to go look for the Sheridans. While he's gone, Emma watches David sleep. I moved from the window and sat on the bed next to David. I gently touched the 2 big welts on his head. They were swollen and bruised. He was sleeping soundly, though, so I took the chance to share my feelings with him. He's not sleeping, Emma. He's unconscious. He has a subdural hematoma. David, I'm sorry you got hurt. You have helped us so much. I took his injured hand and softly caressed it. I'm growing very fond of you. You're courageous and wonderful. When has he been courageous or wonderful? Name one instance in this entire book when he's either courageous or wonderful. I don't mean to sound condescending, but if you have a character describe another character, there probably ought to be some basis for their description. Just something. I bent over and kissed his cheek. Ew. Don't kiss people while they're asleep, Emma. He might live in a time when consent doesn't matter, but you don't. George miraculously returns, having found the Sheridans' apartment above a saloon. I think Chad believes that half the buildings in Denver are saloons. My time had arrived. If I don't go talk to Esther right now, I might not get another chance, I said. They'll be gone by morning. Emma, that's a bad idea, George said. If Henry sees you talking to his wife, he'll probably kill you. I'll go. That's the safest way. No, I need to speak to her in person, I said. I've already escaped death once today. I can do it again. Let's make a plan. Obviously, Emma has lost all ability to think rationally at this point. I don't even know what logical fallacies underline I've escaped death once today, I can do it again. It might be all of them. As for the plan, it's just for George to sell the gold nugget and buy more horses. So Emma knocks on the door of the Sheridans' apartment, and her great-aunt Esther answers. Who are you? I'm a distant relative, I said. You have some family information that I've been searching for. She gave me a bothered look, and I noticed her red-rimmed eyes. Please just go away, she said. I'm packing things up. My husband and I are going our separate ways. As I said before, Chad's characters have no boundaries and no filters when it comes to sharing personal information. Esther doesn't find it at all strange that Emma wants to know the names of her grandparents and where in England they lived. She never even asks why Emma wants to know. I guess they really are related. So once Emma gets the names and cities she needs, she gets to the really important stuff. Esther had given me everything I needed to know to locate the family in English records, but I wanted to hear so much more. I asked, what did your father look like? That's what you want to know? What he looked like? All right. Then Henry returns, and Esther tells Emma to hide, so Emma climbs out the window onto what I assume is a porch roof, although Chad variously describes it as an overhang or an awning. I'm not completely sure what he had in mind. Long story short, Emma manages to bring the entire thing down and goes crashing into the street. Henry runs downstairs, he grabs her, and he just starts strangling her. Esther stops him, and then he decides to pour his heart out to her, in the middle of the street, in the rain, while standing over someone he just tried to murder. He got slowly to his feet with his head hung low. Esther, I meant for you to hear it from me, but I've got enough gold to give us a comfortable life. Please don't leave me. We can make a good, quiet life together. We'll head south and open up a hotel. Esther stared at him. What are you saying, Henry? She asked. Emma didn't mention you have gold. I don't know why we have this subplot about Henry and Esther. It could have worked, maybe, if they'd been in more than 2 scenes. But instead it feels just shoehorned in. She gave me a small hug. I whispered in her ear, "I know Henry is a good man at heart. Give him a chance. I think he'll keep his promises." She looked at me thoughtfully. "As you and I talked, I realized Henry is all I have left," she said. "There's nothing for me in Rhode Island now. We'll give the hotel business a try. You'll have to come stay with us sometime." She walked over to Henry and put her arm around his waist. "This man is foolish at times, and we fight too much, but I really do love him." Okay. Emma leaves them embracing in the middle of the street. Thus ends chapter 12. If Chad were a smarter man, or better writer, this is where Emma's adventures in the past would have ended. There's no reason the story couldn't have ended here. Chad could even have kept his terrible head trauma causes time travel bit by just having Emma hit her head when the roof collapses. Instead, we get 5 more chapters in the Wild West and 5 more in present time. I will try to get through them a bit quickly. George, David, and Emma and their new herd of horses get out of Denver and head back toward Utah. They see a lot of other Mormons along the way. They start traveling with them, in part so they can join these square dances the Mormons have every evening. And here we again see Chad's conflicted feelings about dancing. I'll be honest, I can't figure out why this scene is in the book. I'm going to read it in part because I'm hoping someone in the comments will have a theory that makes sense. After one really hot day on the trail, I was feeling a bit strange, as if I'd been drugged or suffered sunstroke. I didn't want to miss the dance, though. We heard the fiddle start playing, and I headed toward the music, but George stopped me. "Something's wrong with you," he said. "Why don't you go rest in your tent? We'll be there soon." "I'm fine," I said defensively, although I was sweating heavily. He backed off, and we joined the Saints. I soon felt a strange urge to liven things up. I told George, "Let's see how the group likes this." I did my best moonwalk to the center of the dance area. Then I started doing some moves straight from a bad 1970s episode of American Bandstand. The fiddler stopped in mid-chord, and the Saints looked at me as if I were possessed. I then switched to some modern dance routines my friends had taught me, and now even George and David were giving me looks of disgust. I finished with a cheerleading kick before stumbling to my tent. That was all the modern dancing I did on the trail, and thankfully the incident wasn't mentioned in the morning. There's never an explanation for why she did that. Maybe it was just heat stroke. Maybe it was Emma's inability to keep her time-traveling secret coming out through dance. Anyway, Emma realizes she's falling in love with David. George carves a memorial for his brother who disappeared while hunting along this trail. And that's the end of chapter 13. In chapter 14, Emma falls in a river while gathering firewood because she sees a bunch of sticks caught between 2 rocks in the water, and she thinks that wet wood will burn. So David saves her. He's pretty annoyed with her, though, and he stalks off. George put his jacket around my shoulders as we walked back to camp. "You sure know how to keep us on our toes, don't you?" he said. "Poor David has fallen in love, but he's afraid you'll get us all killed before you 2 ever reach the altar." I was cold, but my blood boiled. What altar? Did he really say that? I knew David had taken a liking to me, but I didn't think he actually loved me. He's in love? "That's pretty much what he said," George said sheepishly, knowing he'd said too much. "I can't marry David," I said. "I don't belong here." I like how Chad finds a way to make Emma appear as fickle and deranged as sexist men traditionally think women are. I don't understand why her blood is boiling to hear that David has fallen in love with her. Like, she's in love with David. Wouldn't she be happy? I don't get it. I have no idea why she's angry. Her emotions make no sense. Next, they're accosted by Indians. I would refer to these men by their tribal affiliation, but it's never given. They're just Indians. And I apologize in advance for how offensive and stupid the following excerpts are. "White men took our tribe's horses and killed 2 of our brothers. To pay for it, you two will die, and the girl will go with us. I didn't want to be separated, and I certainly didn't want to be carried off by these two. I won't leave them, I said firmly. You'll have to take us all with you. We'll just kill you all, he said. He got off his horse and pointed the gun at us, directing us to the base of the pine tree. Sit and be quiet. If you talk, you get shot. The men began sifting through our packs. Like, how convenient that these guys speak English, and how helpful of them to explain their motivation. This is one of those situations where Chad hasn't thought about how people actually behave. Like, if you're holding 3 people at gunpoint, and you plan to kill them and steal their stuff, why wouldn't you kill them and then dig through their packs? Like, why are you going to give them an extended chance to escape? And how hard is it to find out what tribe lived or historically lived in the area? Like, Chad likes to brag about how he wrote in the library at BYU. I guarantee they have books on indigenous people from the area there. He could have just looked this up. We also had the internet in 2000, but I'm sure Chad didn't know how to use it. Anyway, as is always the case, God saves them. Emma decides to start singing a hymn while these men dig through her pack, and they're moved. Then the younger man said to me, I am angry over the deaths of my brothers, but the Great Spirit is with you. My father says we would offend the Great Spirit by killing you, so you will live. Not all indigenous people believed in a Great Spirit. I can't say if these people did or not because I have no idea what tribe they're from. But I feel like that's probably just something Chad had heard in a movie and decided to slap on here. I don't know why the stereotype of the noble savage needed to appear in this story. It's like Chad can't resist. So they leave without killing anyone, but they do steal all the horses, thereby ensuring the financial ruin of Mary Infinity. Thus ends chapter 14. Luckily, they're only a day's walk from home, so our so-called heroes make it back to Mary Infinity's house, and David goes back to his house. Thanks for everything, David, George said. You were a lifesaver, literally. This line of dialogue makes me cringe. Lifesavers, which were known then as life buoys or Kisby rings, were not in widespread use, and certainly weren't available in landlocked Utah. Also, I don't think anyone was attaching literally to the ends of sentences as an intensifier in the 1860s. That's a bit harder to research, though. Luckily, thus ends chapter 15. Emma is reunited with Finity and Mary and their 12-year-old daughter Elizabeth, the one Chad previously described as a tease. I was worried that Elizabeth was still angry about the quarrel we'd had over David. My first day back, I cautiously asked her, "Can we work things out? I'm sorry we fought about David." "What are you talking about?" "Don't you remember our fight before we left?" "Oh, that's all in the past," she said. "You can have David. I'm in love with Frank now." My eyes bugged out of my head. Frank? How did this girl keep finding boys? I mean, she does live in a society. It's not that surprising that there are men in it. But don't worry, Frank's only 17. I guess that's par for the course, but I'm as perplexed as Elizabeth about this fight Emma wants to conclude. There's no fight between Emma and Elizabeth over David at any point in this story. So Emma has now completed her mission, but she's still stuck in the past and doesn't know why. So she asks Mary Infinity if she can live with them, and they ask if it's because she's in love with David. And instead of just saying yes, which would be true because she is in love with David, she decides to tell them that she's from the future. She does not think through whether or not this is a good idea. Like, first she flatters them by telling them about all the generations that are come out after them, and then she tells them when they're going to die, and then she goes like right into cars, highways, dishwashers, sewing machines, grain threshers, both world wars, the Great Depression, airplanes, and finally the moon landing. And they're totally on board until the moon landing, and then Finity decides he needs to check in with Brigham Young and make sure this girl isn't crazy. Don't get me started also on the idea that Finity could have mailed a letter and gotten a reply in 5 days. That is just not historically accurate. But Brigham Young sends back a note that essentially says, yeah, she's from the future, and I told her not to tell anyone. Thus ends chapter 15. Emma continues to live in the past. She learns to milk a cow and wonders, as we all do, why God hasn't sent her back to her time yet. David finally asks Emma to go to a dance with him on the condition that she never do the moonwalk again. Unfortunately, Emma's beauty ruins the evening. An unforeseen problem arose when we arrived at the dance, though. Many of Heber's young men wanted to share company with the new girl in town, and they sometimes would cut in on us during a dance, forcing David out of the way. But David danced with me as much as possible, each time asking me why I was dancing with those city boys. I kept telling him I didn't have a choice. As the dance went on, I saw David's patience wearing thin, and I finally told him to take me home. David is too immature to share Emma with other boys in town. Even though the evening was a bust, they profess their undying love, and then they make out a little, before Emma dramatically declares that they can never be together and runs off to the barn's hayloft. Why? Because Chad needs somewhere high to throw her from. She trips, falls out of the hayloft, and knocks herself unconscious. But apparently there's enough time between her hitting her head and passing out for her to hear David cry, "Emma, please be all right. I love you." Thus ends chapter 16. Emma wakes up back in her time and learns she's been missing for months. She tells the police that she was kidnapped by two strange men who took her to Denver on horseback. I'm not kidding. And they just eat it up. No one ever questions this story. Not even when Emma starts doing international news organization interviews about it. My 15 minutes of fame quickly ended. A search was launched for my kidnappers, but after a few weeks, my case was filed away with other unsolved crimes. What can you do? Sometimes people just get taken to Denver on horseback and then returned unharmed for no apparent reason. The Sherry Papini case, this is not. Emma goes to a museum and watches a film the LDS Church made called Legacy. I was curious about why this film was mentioned, so I found it on YouTube and I watched it. It's about an hour long. It's pretty good. I have to give the church credit. They really sink a lot of money into video productions. This was hundreds of extras, full costumes, horses. I was impressed. The only answer I came up with after watching this movie is that Chad has no imagination and has to steal everything from somewhere. And so he stole some stuff from Legacy. Here's what he wrote. The family in the film had a son named Johnny. He reminded me so much of George, even down to the clothes he wore. When Johnny was killed by a mob at Haun's Mill, it pierced my soul. Then the new convert David came onto the scene, and I was mesmerized. His kindness and playful ways reminded me so much of my David. So I think we can safely add Legacy to the list of works Chad ripped off, although the only thing the two Davids have in common are Mormonism and sexism. Emma is so upset over seeing this character in the movie and remembering her lost love that she decides to tell her parents what really happened during her kidnapping. She says, "We need to go somewhere private, Dad, with no chance of being interrupted." So they go to a public park. Because no one's ever been interrupted in a public park. We drove up Hobble Creek Canyon to the Kelly's Grove picnic area. We sat at a table under a secluded pavilion, and I told them the whole story, even the smooching I did with David. "Whew, it could have been worse," Dad said. "So you believe me?" "Of course," they said in unison. Frankly, it sounds like her parents don't care what insanity she believes as long as she's not pregnant. They don't say that, but mostly they're just happy that she got the information about their ancestors. Then Chad's ego rears its head again. Emma has gone through all of this in order to help her ancestors. But now, something else is on her mind. Her. We agreed to start doing the research the following Sunday, but I couldn't wait that long to see if my adventures had been recorded by the people I'd known in 1868. I didn't even bother checking Brigham Young's discourses. He never would have mentioned me. I searched through all the Dalton histories, but apparently I was just a blip on the radar screen of their lives, not worth even a sentence. I was sad that neither Finity nor Mary had written anything about their lives. What would Finity have written about me anyways? We housed a girl from the future in the summer of 1868. No way. George's history was puzzling because he did mention traveling to Denver as a teenager, and he even talked about carving Robert Stone, but he never mentioned the people he'd traveled with. Ugh, so close. What's most important to Emma isn't finding out how the lives of the people she knew in the past turned out, it's finding out if they mentioned her. The only person she cares about is her. This incredible self-centeredness is even more apparent when she goes to the family history library and looks up David. I was stunned. He'd actually gotten married. So what if he'd waited nearly 6 years after I'd disappeared? I felt discarded. That two-timing jerk, I muttered, banging my fist on the desk. You shouted at him that you couldn't be with him. You ghosted him. And now you're mad that he only waited 6 years to see if you'd come back? Seriously though, this scene has Chad's narcissism written all over it. Thus ends chapter 18. Emma and her parents do a bunch of research on their ancestors, and then they go to the temple and perform the necessary rituals. Not being LDS, I don't entirely understand what this entails, but apparently Emma gets baptized on behalf of 20 of her ancestors. And the guy who baptizes her is hot. I could have stood there and stared at him for another 10 minutes on his good looks alone. There are about a dozen ways to write this sentence, and they're all better than this way. Emma immediately becomes obsessed with this character, whose name is Tad, and is shocked, just shocked, to learn that he has David's last name. If you haven't read a lot of time travel fiction, you probably aren't aware, but having a character who falls in love with someone in the past and then winds up with their descendant in the future is a huge cliche, like a big red honking cliche. And it's also the reason this book has 3 more chapters. So in chapter 20, Emma and Tad start dating. It is as boring as you would imagine. They take biology together. They attend Doug's sporting games. They play mini golf. I mean, my partner and I love mini golf, so I'm okay with that part. But Tad accepts Emma's very weak explanation for why she couldn't get away from her kidnappers. All this time she claims to be waiting for an opportunity to confirm that he's David's great whatever grandson, but I don't understand why she can't just go back to the family history library and check. Maybe there's a reason, but I kind of think Chad just wanted to do this other thing, so he ignored the obvious logical action. So instead, she and Tad go visit his grandpa Charles, who conveniently has photographs of David. And then Grandpa Charles says this: nearly all of the North boys married fairly young. I think David himself was the oldest to marry. Ironically, it was his advice that has prompted his descendants to not delay marriage once they found their true love. What was David's advice? He told his son and grandsons, once you've found the girl of your dreams, don't let her slip through your fingers. Emma literally runs home and cries, but all I could think when I read this was how disrespectful to his wife it was. I can just imagine this guy telling his sons, like, when you find a hot girl, marry her. Otherwise she might vanish in a hayloft, and you'll be stuck waiting 6 years before you finally decide to marry whoever's left. Not surprisingly, Tad proposes to Emma. He seems to have intended to do this at a brick oven pizza location, which just amused me. I don't know. Somehow a mid-range Italian restaurant chain to seem like the most romantic place for a proposal. It seems more like the place you'd go for dinner before prom or something. She says yes, but then she tells him she has to come clean about her kidnapping. So she recounts the entire story. And at the end, Tad replies, "Are you saying the only guy you've ever kissed besides me is some old ancestor of mine? That's really bizarre, Emma." That's where his mind went? Who else she might have kissed? Why doesn't anyone in this book have a normal reaction to hearing about time travel? I mean, it's probably because Chad has no imagination and can't actually imagine what it would be like to hear such a thing. So, anyway, Tad doesn't believe her. Emma slaps him in the face, throws her engagement ring at him, and storms off. Thus ends chapter 20. Don't hit people, Emma. Emma goes to biology class the next day, but leaves because Tad is there. I stayed in this terrible funk for the next 5 days, although I did manage to make it to every class except biology. I figured that if Tad and I got together again, he'd help me catch up on my homework. If not, I'd just take an incomplete and retake biology next semester. That's a terrible attitude, but I was now more scatterbrained than usual. For example, I slowly drove past Tad's apartment about 4 times a day. I think his roommates saw me a few times. I realize now how desperate and pathetic I looked. Again, Chad seems to not know what scatterbrained means. Skipping class because you don't want to see your ex isn't scatterbrained. And driving by his apartment 4 times a day definitely isn't scatterbrained. Chad continues to struggle to describe people and their behaviors. He's kind of just throwing adjectives around willy-nilly, airheaded, scatterbrained, kind, courageous, but he doesn't seem to understand what they actually mean. And I find that kind of fascinating. Eventually, Tad shows up at Emma's house with David's diary, which Grandpa Charles dug out of his basement in order to save their relationship. David wrote this in the diary. These events took place when I was 19, in the summer of 1868, and they happened because of a beautiful young woman named Emma Dalton. She came in and out of my life like a brief flash of wonderful sunlight. I've never met another girl like her, except for my lovely Judy, of course. Yeah, but you didn't fill a journal with stories about Judy, did you? I closed the book and scooted closer to Tad. Thank you for believing me, I said. You mean everything to me. He didn't believe you. He needed proof. He never believed you. You better hope Grandpa Charles has something else he can dig out of the basement the next time you have a relationship crisis. Thus ends chapter 21. The final chapter of this book sees the return of Leah. Remember Leah from 800 years ago when we started this? It was her funeral from which Emma disappeared. Well, Leah is still dead, but her sister has received a psychic impression that Leah and her fiancé, the one who died in World War II, want to be married in the spirit world. So Emma and Tad decide that they'll get married for Leah and Harold by proxy at the same time. As with proxy baptism in the LDS Church, you can get proxy married. So Emma and Tad and Leah and Harold all get hitched simultaneously. Thus ends an errand for Emma. So, a few thoughts. First, because the goal of this video is partly educational, I want to talk briefly about how Chad could have fixed this book. The biggest thing to my way of thinking is that Emma lacks agency. She almost never does anything. She just stumbles from one situation to the next. She doesn't choose to go back in time. She's sent by God. She doesn't decide to look for her ancestors. God tells her to in a dream. She doesn't figure out how to get to Denver. Mary Infinity and Brigham Young do. She doesn't even find Esther Sheridan. George does. Emma is uselessly passive. She's a pinball. I think this problem is rooted in Chad's writing method, and him basically not having one. And I'm not mocking him when I say that. It's in his autobiography. I mean, that whole section where he talks about God downloading scenes directly into his brain through his torn veil. That's why he doesn't need creativity. And he says he's not creative. And what's ironic to me is that a lot of writers feel that we aren't so much sitting down and inventing things as that the stories are sort of revealing themselves to us. This is a really common experience. And you can attribute it to God or a muse or your own subconscious as you see fit. But you have to accept that this isn't the end of the process. And I think Chad feels that because the ideas came from God, he doesn't need to edit. That it would be like editing the Bible. It would somehow be inappropriate. It would be blaspheming against God's word. So he's just not editing. He's writing a first draft. He's not thinking about what he's going to write. And then he's deciding that's sacrosanct and can't be changed. But for the rest of us, we work on ideas. We shape them. They come from wherever. They come from God. They come from our minds. And we mold them. And we think about, will this work in this context? And we do research if we're writing historical fiction. We ask ourselves, if I were a 19-year-old woman who suddenly found herself 130 years in the past and I desperately needed to get to Denver, how would I get there? I don't think Chad has ever done that, because I don't think Chad is capable of putting himself in the shoes of other people. I don't think he's capable of empathy. So I'm not going to bother saying that he should have written more complex characters. He really can't. Emma's flatness isn't just a reflection of not being able to empathize others, though. I think it's probably a reflection of him not knowing himself very well and not being capable of insight into who he is. The second point that I want to make is that this story would have worked better if Emma had fallen, hit her head, and returned to her own time immediately after she spoke to Esther Sheridan. The only reason I can think of that Chad wanted to include her return trip to Mary Infinity's house was so that she and David could fall in love, but they didn't actually fall in love on the return trip. There was never anything in there that I would call the two of them falling in love. Emma just sort of declared that she was now in love with him. That could just as easily have happened on the way to Denver. The goal of the story was to get the information from Esther. So the climax of the story is the scene where Emma and Esther talk. It shouldn't come on page 79 of a 141-page book. That's madness. Everything after the climax should be denouement. It should be things settling down. And the denouement shouldn't take up 44% of the book. So those are my thoughts as an editor on what could have been done to marginally improve this story. It still wouldn't have been good, but it would have been better. But second, let's consider what we've learned about Chad from this book. We've learned that his characters are either good or evil, with almost no room in between, and that you can tell if they're good or evil by how attractive they are. The only non-Mormon who wasn't evil was Esther. I guess you could say John wasn't completely evil, and I think the reason he let Emma and the guys go was partly that Chad couldn't think of another way to get them free. But I think the bigger reason is Chad really thought that he was having Emma be clever and manipulative. I think he'd seen scenes in movies or read them maybe in books. I don't know how much Chad reads, actually. But he'd seen scenes where a character who was a hostage manipulated the person who was holding them hostage emotionally and convinced them to let them go. And I think he thought that's what he was writing in this scene. But he doesn't understand how people work. So he doesn't understand how they manipulate each other. And so instead we just get Emma making small talk and then asking if this guy wants to watch her die. We've learned that Chad struggles to understand and describe people. All of his good characters are the same as all his other good characters. All his evil characters are the same as all his other evil characters. There's no difference in personality between George or Doug or Emma or Tad. They're all exactly the same person. And disturbingly, we've learned that Chad can't differentiate between children and adults. When Emma is scouring history books to see if anyone mentioned her, she finds out that Elizabeth did indeed marry the man she warned Emma away from. And Emma thinks, all right, she finally got her man. Elizabeth is 12. She doesn't need a man. And Chad would have had kids this age. And finally, we've learned that Chad has no creativity. He can't even come up with names for characters. He takes them from friends and family members. He changed the surnames and used his own family history as the basis for this story. And his next book begins with a flat-out autobiographical account of his mission in Newark, New Jersey, which he really thinks is like RoboCop's Detroit. Finally, I want to say that this is the lightest, most innocent of Chad's books. From here they only get darker, weirder, more disturbing, more violent. And I'm starting to realize that you can actually trace the development of his criminal insanity through the stories. So if you enjoyed this video, and you'd like to take the plunge into his next masterpiece, please consider subscribing. In case it needs to be said, please don't reach out to or harass anyone with any connection to this case. Chad and Lori's families aren't to blame, and they've suffered enough. And on that note, remember to use your words wisely. Thanks.